Hello and welcome to making a quilt about some art concepts. I have called this quilt the Vignettes Quilt, and the name is because of the technique that we're going to use to explore all of the different art concepts. This is my third quilt pattern, and it is another instruction quilt pattern. So even though all of the participants making this quilt are going to have the same set of instructions, they will not necessarily walk away with a quilt that looks the same. They will be able to add their own flavor to it. The things that are super exciting happening here are we're going to learn about vignettes. And as you can see on the paper that you may have printed, our 32-page quilt pattern plus supplemental pages, you will have learned that vignettes, essentially, as I think about them when I'm making a quilt, are small blocks that you will figure out how to piece together later. So a key aspect of the vignette that makes it different from a traditional quilt block is that it can be any size. You could have a long skinny one and a super tiny one and a square and then a different size square and then maybe something wonky like a circle or an oval or a rainbow shape. And those all count as vignettes. When you're making them, you're thinking about what the overall quilt will look like or the prompt for each vignette. And you are at that time not worrying about how they're going to get pieced together. This particular quilt pattern, as we make our vignettes, we are going to have a prompt for each vignette related to an art element, a postmodern principle, or a principle of art or design. So there are 7 elements, 10 postmodern principles, and 7 principles. We are not, however, necessarily making 24 blocks. Or vignettes. We're going to make a vignette for each of the 7 elements, and that will be one of our early steps. Then we'll make a vignette for each of our 10 postmodern principles. Some of them might be tricky though. So if you find yourself stuck or unable to move forward, you can always just do 7 of them, or just do 8, or just do 5. And that is fine. The total number of vignettes doesn't matter because we're not fitting them into a perfect grid. So if you do 5 really great, really interesting vignettes for the postmodern principles, that is enough and it's just fine. And you're getting yourself familiar with some of that vocabulary, even if you're not making a block for every single word. Then as we move into the principles of art and design, we are going to look through all of the blocks that we've already made and identify where we have already intuitively used those principles. If you can't find a spot where you've done that, you can always add another block then and make sure that you do have some way of noticing each of those principles. From there, much later on in the workshop, we're going to talk about how to sew all of those vignettes to each other. So that will be a really exciting phase and is one that we will deal with the particulars later. It's really important that when you're making your vignettes, you feel free to just make them any shape, any size, and not worry about how they will go together in the end. So take a moment to digest that, and then we will meet back to talk about step number 1. Step 1 of the Vignettes quilt is collect. This is titled partly after the idea of art collectors, people who collect art. You don't have to be rich to do it. You just have to like art. Most of us have a fair amount of art in our homes in one form or another. And so I would say that most of us in one way or another are art collectors. So with that nod to the art world and collecting, we are going to collect our fabrics that we'll be using in this workshop. I'd like us to focus on just a few of our elements and our postmodern principles. It's an opportunity for us to gain some familiarity with them. So, as we begin, we're going to focus on two elements of art, the element of color and the element of value. Color, or the lack thereof, is a really rich, complex subject. You can approach going into your fabric area and choosing fabrics based on colors from any angle that feels good for you. One possible option is to choose a favorite color. And so here I have clearly chosen the color yellow. I really like yellow. Some of my favorite quilts that I've made in the past have a lot of yellow in them. And it was fun to go through my stash and pull out things that had yellow, whether they're patterns or solids. And here we're starting to get a real shift within yellow. That is also a little bit of our second element of value. Value is about creating contrast, having highs and lows, being able to move through something called a grayscale, where you're looking at light versions, middle versions, and dark versions of either black and white or a color. So by getting the whole spectrum of yellow, I was able to start to create some value. I've got dark yellows, light yellows, super light yellows, bold primary things, just a whole wonderful mix of yellows. So that is partly how I went through and found color and value when I was looking through my scraps, or not scraps, my yardage. We are also going to be looking at some of the postmodern principles. One is appropriation, which means in a lot of ways to borrow. Prints are designed by other makers, usually called fabric designers. So it's something that they thought of that we are incorporating into our art. That is inherently appropriation. That also includes found objects, elements of popular culture, clothing that was obviously designed by someone else. It can be easy to think that we are being super creative all on our own from nothing. But most of the time, we are working in collaboration with other people, especially since we as quilters do not start with a blank white canvas and then add pigment to that canvas to just make anything. Maybe you could do something without appropriating, although there's so many techniques that have already been thought of and named and different ways of deciding things that even if you're working just with paint on canvas, you're probably going to do some appropriation at one point or another. But since we are quilters, we are using lots of fabrics that were designed by other people. And there's also a long tradition of the ways that we join things together. And that is also appropriation. So if I do a courthouse steps block, that is me appropriating that traditional block from somewhere else and incorporating it into my work. There's also lots of ways of sewing things. And depending on the stitch that I use or the type of thread, I'm appropriating whip stitch or running stitch. So we're not working in a vacuum, we're working with other people. And by choosing fabrics that connect to appropriation, we are able to own that a little bit more specifically. Some of the most of my yellows are appropriated as well, right? I did not think of this particular fabric. But I also have a variety of blocks that are already sewn. Someone else did this. I did not piece them together, and they were found in a shop, and then someone from Florida mailed them to me in the mail as a present. So I've got these blocks. I also have a linen napkin or table runner. I don't know what it is, but I know I didn't make it and it's appropriated. So I grabbed that. Here's some quilt blocks that are made by someone who is not me. Clearly the same person made both of these because they have the same print in them. But beyond that, I don't know much about them, but they might make it into my quilt. Here's a particularly unique print that definitely counts as appropriation. Here we've got knights in armor with a family crest. It looks like this was a curtain at one point, so it's already had a previous life. And this designer probably did not think of this crest or the fleur-de-lis that existed already, but the designer turned it into fabric, so it was appropriated once, and now it might be appropriated again as I turn it into a quilt. Our next concept to keep in mind when we're collecting our fabric to work on this quilt together is economy. Economy is about simplicity. Minimalist art has a lot of economy. Also, anything that saves me from having to do a lot of work. So in some ways, I've already used this postmodern principle of economy. I decided when looking at color, rather than trying to grab fabrics from the whole rainbow, I efficiently just chose yellow. I chose just one fabric. I also have found these appropriated fabrics, and some of them might help me fill in one of the later prompts so that I don't have to piece my block at all. I can just say, boom, here's a block, it's done, moving on to the next step. When it comes to economy, less is more. So just keeping that in the back of your head. You don't need to pull 100 fabrics for this quilt. You can go in with the mindset, you're just gonna pull a few. And then finally, representation. Representation has to do with my identity and affiliations. Perhaps they're going to be textiles that I've lived with, that I connect to with my personal history. So here I have a pile of fabrics that remind me of my childhood. I have this apple print that my mom bought, and she used her main use for fabric growing up. I mean, she did sew Halloween costumes for me and some clothing for me, but she especially loves to buy fabric to use to cover jam jars because my mom is super talented in the kitchen. So she got this apple fabric to put on top of jam jars. This is a scrap, very unusual shaped scrap that came from my grandmother. I don't know if this was a dress or a tablecloth, but this fabric, when I see it, gives me a visceral memory of my grandmother. I know for sure that this fabric is from her. Here, I have many strawberry print fabrics. And these also go back to my mom and Jam, as well as my former next door neighbor, Jean. So about half of them are from her and half are from my mother. And that to me feels representational of my past. Certainly there are lots of other fabrics that I could have also grabbed that would connect with who I am, but these are good for right now. As you potentially might be peeking ahead to step 2, you're going to notice that we're going to be working on the elements of art. And we'll want to find fabric or blocks that connect to each element of art. I'm going to go into those in more detail later, but you're welcome to keep them in the back of your mind as well as you're pulling fabrics. So line, shape, form, value, space, texture, color. Those are the focal point of our upcoming blocks, and it might be helpful to keep them also in mind as you consider which fabrics you're going to pull. We will also be getting into the postmodern principles, and some of them are more obvious than others. Certainly, we've already talked about 3 of them: appropriation, economy, and representation. One that you might notice also coming up is text. And so here I've pulled a variety of fabrics that I have that have to do with text. Certainly, they all fall under the appropriation category as well. So I've got this seed bag, and that is appropriated. It's from a brand. It definitely belongs to someone, but it also has text on it, which is interesting. I've got this map of the world with text for each of the countries. What could be a better example of appropriation than Campbell's soup fabric? This has to do with representation. It's a gift. It's inherited from my next door neighbor, Jean. It is a food that I grew up eating. It certainly connects to my love of Andy Warhol, the pop artist who made this initially popular. It's appropriation because it's a brand that then became art, that then became more than just that series of paintings. And it also has text on it. So I might have initially pulled it because of appropriation, but it could later fit in with the text prompt. This is not text. Here's more maps. I've got this fabric with numbers on it. That counts as text as well. Oh, I have this darling print from when I was in Korea, and it has phrases like camping fun time and tulip and the word travel car. I especially loved it when I bought it because not everything is in perfect English. You can tell that they are appropriating these English words, and they understand most of them, but not all. And it was just such a beautiful hybrid of cultures. Here are some advertisements. This also reminds me of Andy Warhol. It's got a lot of text in it. More text, recipes, Asian letters, the names of flowers and plants, crossword puzzles, brassiere fabric, and these gentlemen in construction who are obviously measuring things and writing words. And finally, the powers of nature and some not so legible text around the powers of nature. So it's interesting how some of these words can be read and other words not so much. So these all count as appropriation, but they will also later count as text, and some of them might also count as hybridity, where they are merging multiple things. For now, the very important thing is that you choose some fabric, and that when you look at it, it might have some general pleasantness to your eye when you look at all of it together. Hopefully it also has some playfulness, and when we meet back, you'll have some fabric pulled, and we're going to use that fabric to go through the elements of art. I will have some samples of each block and also some samples of fabric that connect to each block. I'll see you then with your fabric. All right, welcome back. Hopefully you have printed or looked at this step in the pattern, and you've collected your fabrics based on those 5 different concepts that we discussed in the last segment. Here, I want to share with you some details about the elements of art. We are going to talk now about all 7 elements of art. Sometimes, especially back when I was a high school art teacher, we would have heated debates about, are there 7? Are there 8? Are there 6? What other elements might there be? These are not set in stone. None of them are. But they're helpful tools for discussing art, for being clear about what we mean, about what we're doing. And this is my favorite set of 7, and I think a set of elements that you will frequently see out in the world. It's one of the favorite sets. So here, the task is to make a vignette inspired by each of these 7 elements of art. It is up to you how you do those vignettes. You can use any piecing techniques by hand or by machine that you like to use. You can make your vignettes very small, or you can make them large. They can all be the same size if that is inspiring to you, but it's also really exciting to work with a variety of sizes. Give yourself some challenges for later. And these vignettes, you can do these elements in any order, so you don't have to do them in the order that I've written them. You can do them in the order that they occur to you. And apart from that, there's no big set rules. Some of them could be very similar. It could even be a fun plan for you to think of how could you make all 7 of these as similar as possible, but only change the emphasis on which element you're using. So for example, if you wanted to use the courthouse steps block, you could try to do all 7 of these elements as a focal point within that traditional block. You don't have to do that. That's not what I did, but it's an option. It gives you hopefully a sense of the scope that's available to you here. We'll begin with line. So looking at our page online, I've made a variety of drawings that all connect to line. I have some points to consider, and I've also shared some details about lines. Lines probably are what you think they are. There's not a secret special definition. But what is important here is the awareness that the art, that the thing we're looking at is created with a line. You might, for some of these, choose just to use a single cut of fabric. So this fabric was chosen from my representation section because it's a fabric that I got from my grandmother, and her and my aunt actually did an embroidered version of this. They filled it all in with embroidery, and I turned it into a purse, and I wore it around for several years, especially in and after college. So this print strongly reminds me of my grandmother, which connects to that representation prompt. It also is perhaps interesting in the context of value because it's got black and white, creates contrast there. But most importantly right now, this is a line drawing. All of the imagery that we see here is made with line, and cutting just a little square of this would count as making my vignette about line. This grid is also, I think, a particularly beautiful print. It is some men's shirting, and it is made on a grid with line. They're just 2 shades of line. There's the dark blue and a gray with a cream background. So this also connects a bit with value, and it's got lines on it. Finally, this print has lines. I bought this back in 2015 at B&J Fabrics in New York City, and it was this existential moment of who am I? What fabrics do I own? how do my fabrics create opportunities for me? And I have not used it yet. I continue to think it's very beautiful though. And it is a line drawing. It really highlights line. The last fabric focused on line is stripes, for obvious reasons. The quilt block, the vignette that I made about line, I put this little post-it on it so that I could keep track of everything, so I could easily know that I was ticking off all 7 of these. You could also use this page in the pattern and just stack your vignette on top of each printed page as you complete them. This is my vignette on line. You can see it is a very long strip. I thought it would be nice if the strip were a line itself. And I went through and I did a pleat, I did a pin tuck, and I did a dotted line. And those lines go all the way from top to bottom. So for me, that depicted line. Our next element is shape. So here again, you see some examples of shapes, a fuzzy shape, a carefully defined shape. We get into the idea of organic shape and geometric shapes. You can see, of course, flying geese quilt pattern is a nod to the big history of shapes in the quilt world. Here are several shape fabrics. You can see this is made with shapes. It's not just skinny lines. There are circles and leaves. And this fabric is interesting just because of shapes. This was from the same shopping trip in New York. Also have not used this fabric yet, but here we see the silhouettes of lots of animals. A lion, elephant, giraffe, be a deer or a goat, a turtle. So these silhouettes are all about shape. And finally, this print, you can see it's just 2 colors, and it is also just about shape on shape. There are no lines here. There's no illusion of form. It doesn't look 3-dimensional. It's just shapes. As I made this quilt pattern, I thought, let's keep it simple. I made a shape. The shape that I made is a rectangle. And that's about all there is to it. It's very to the point, very simple. I stuck with, again, that yellow that I chose in my color palette. So having lots of things that are the same color, the color scheme word for that is monochromatic. And here I'm working on that. These are analogous colors because orange is next to yellow on the color wheel. And they're also both warm colors because yellow, orange, and red are warm colors. I wasn't thinking about that so deeply though, as I was thinking about shape and making a rectangle on top of a rectangular piece of fabric. Okay, we're moving on to form. Form is 3-dimensional. You can see I've drawn a tumbling blocks quilt pattern that creates the illusion of form just by using shapes. It's really an amazing, clever pattern. I've also chosen a photograph of some leaves that look 3-dimensional. I have tried my best to illustrate some trapunto where something is stuffed and fluffy. And then here, created the illusion, perhaps, that things are raised where this pink is lighter and things are lowered where the pink is darker. Some fabrics with form in them are this hummingbird print. So there are 3-dimensional looking hummingbirds next to 3-dimensional looking flowers and leaves. This bird looks like it's flying through the air. Very 3-dimensional, lots of form. This fabric is also one that creates the illusion of form. I can see these flowers looking three-dimensional because they have the highlights of the white and then the lowlights of that darker pink and the black, and they look 3D. Finally, this is some form that I can feel. So this is a white fabric with white flowers embroidered on it, and it creates that sense of form in a three-dimensional quality. The block that I have made to represent form, again, I've used a yellow background, and I have done some trapunto. I think it's really fun to make my trapunto three-dimensional. So trapunto is inherently three-dimensional. I think it's fun to use transparent fabrics so you can see what I have used as stuffing in my trapunto. When you look in here, I've got some yarn, some thread scraps, and a variety of colors. I also have left my knots raised on some of these little packets of trapunto to add even more form and more three-dimensional quality to this vignette. So this one is almost a square-shaped vignette. The other two were definitely rectangles. So I'm continuing to play with the scale of my vignettes. Next up is value. Value is about a range from dark to light. That can happen in a color like blue or in black and white. Can also be different tints and tones and shades. So this pink is not as uniform. There's more of a fuchsia and also a crimson, and it's not like that perfect grayscale, but it still does have a variety of values in it. This blue reminds me a lot of indigo being dipped and that natural, beautiful ombre color that happens in the fabric. For value, oh, that is in the wrong order. Where is my value? Okay. For value, I have this black and white print fabric. Yes, it has the illusion of form. It looks 3D, but it also is achieving that with lots of shifts in white to black and gray. So that is why it has value. This fabric is also one with a lot of value. When you look at it, it's a lot of cross-hatching, which is a way of using lines layered on top of one another to create the illusion of form and a shift from light to dark, creating value. So here we can see swans, a horse, a man riding a horse, and this is a fabric with a lot of value, that shift of light to dark. This is fabric that I dyed myself, and I think it has a little bit of that ombre quality in certain areas. So as I unfurl this fabric, there are places where it shifts from light to middle to dark, and I like the very organic, natural way that it does that. So this is another fabric with value. This is the block that I have made to represent value. I've got several shades of yellow. It seemed like the obvious choice here because I pulled so many different yellows when I was choosing my fabrics. And I'm moving through different amounts of boldness and lightness and darkness. So this I have folded my edges under and done a running stitch to sew this. It's the same technique that I used for my last piece of applique. Remember that you can use any techniques that you want to, that you feel comfortable with, but certainly the running stitch by hand is very easy to do and very accessible. Our next element is space. As we look at space, we are going to notice that there are a couple different ways to perceive space. Space might be about positive and negative space. The space of the focal point, for example, on the screen right now, I am the focal point, and the background, the things around me, those are negative space. I'm positive space, this other area, negative. We also, when we look at space, can think about perspective, the illusion of distance. Anytime we get the sense that something is near and something else is far, we have perspective. If I hold up two thumbs, one thumb is very close to you and looks bigger. The other thumb is far away and it looks smaller. That is another way of understanding perspective, that the bigger thing is closer, the smaller thing is farther away. So that is also an aspect of the element of space. My fabrics that connect to space are this tablecloth that belonged to my grandmother. One of the things that I really like about it is that here the red is the flower and the white is the background. And then on the edge, the red is the background and the white is the flower, that they're inverting the colors on this print so that they're playing with space, that sometimes red is the background and other times red is the foreground. This vintage pink fabric also seems very much about space. There's a frame around something. It looks like very much positive space and negative space. This pink is the negative space, the space around things. So this fabric to me highlighted, again, positive and negative space. Finally, this is one of my favorite fabrics, and it creates the illusion of space in that we can see a beautiful scene of a boy and also a girl, if we get to if we see enough of the fabric, who are wandering in the woods. And we see the trees and the bunnies and the flowers, and they are creating the illusion of space. There's also a very strong negative space. Nothing in this fabric is overlapping anything else. So the trees stand alone, the boy stands alone, and the background, the negative space, is all this dark blue. My answer to the prompt for space was to use this found textile. So this was effortless. I already grabbed it in the process of finding my fabrics. This is something, of course, inspired by appropriation. Someone else sewed it together. Now it's mine, I'm using it. And it, to me, had a very strong sense of positive and negative space. The negative space is all of these white areas. And the positive space, of course, is the colors. Our next element is texture, the surface quality of an object, whether something is rough or smooth, if there are knots on it. A very important distinction is, of course, the types of textures, and the other distinction is whether it is a real texture or an implied texture. It can look one way and feel another way. And that is an occasion where something has an implied texture. So here I have drawn something that maybe looks like fur, but when I touch it, it is 100% smooth. Anything that would have been drawn on this piece of paper is inherently only implied texture because it's a flat drawing. When we're working with quilts though, we have the option to make both real textures and implied textures. So here I have two fabrics that both have texture in the mix. This white fabric, when I touch it, I can feel almost like Braille, all of these little dots. They are raised and they are a different texture. I also have these carnation flowers in this floral print, and this is almost a photographic image. It looks so lush and textured, as though I could feel the flowers, but it feels completely smooth. Another example of texture is this fabric that we looked at earlier when we were exploring form. So this had a real form. It was really three-dimensional. And that also means that it has real texture that I can feel. My block that explores texture is this one. So here I have contrasted or juxtaposed a rough linen texture against a slinky silk texture. So here I'm highlighting texture by showing the opposites. I also have used yardage, fabric from a store, contrasted with this table linen that is a found object. So that's another nice type of contrast that's showing up here. I liked the tablecloth because it also has texture. You can literally feel the texture that's raised here, as well as I can literally feel the difference between this linen, which is rough, and this slinky, silky stuff, which is smooth. So it's both visually different in texture and physically different in texture. Our last element is color. These are merely touching the tip of an iceberg. Color is an element that feels like it should be more than just an element because you can go so deep into color and color theory, whereas texture and shape and form are relatively straightforward to comprehend. Color has this infinite complexity to it. Here, for example, I've drawn tints, which is a color with white added. I've done the actual color, and then here it's debatable whether or not I've made a shade or a tone because I think some of the white is inherently mixing in, but a color plus gray is a tone and a color plus black is a shade. You can also have a variety of just genuinely different colors. So the pigment in these is different, but that does not mean that there's an addition of white or gray or black in these pinks. Here, I've done a watercolor that shifts from red to purple to blue. These colors are next to each other on the color wheel. The primary colors of red and blue naturally mix together to make purple. So our primary colors are blue, yellow, and red. And our secondary colors are green, purple, and orange. Those are the colors on the color wheel that mix to make one another. Some interesting things to consider as you approach this block about color is favorite colors, ugly colors, dusty colors, which could be like a tone. You can explore colors made with natural dye or synthetic dye. If there are expensive colors or traditional colors. I personally have made a lot of quilts about neutral colors. You might also want to think about your wardrobe. What colors do you frequently wear in your clothing, and how are those interesting to incorporate? The fabrics that I've pulled for color, this one I hope is obvious. This is a synthetic polyester fabric, and it has this just unbelievable vibrancy to it. It's a very beautiful color. This was a garment at one point, so it also has that feeling of being appropriated, and very playful color fabric. I have also chosen this rayon yellow. So it's a blend of linen and rayon together. It's very mustardy, ochre, solid yellow. It is the same yellow that I used in my texture block, as well as the same yellow that I used in my line block. It's a go-to fabric for me. You can see I own a lot of it, and it made sense as a choice for color. And then finally, there's this monochromatic print. This is a beautiful block print that I'm told is from Japan. My mother purchased it at an estate's garage sale for me in Florida. And so it's on a couple different lives now, but it's just beautiful the way that it is pink and fuchsia together. And that makes it a monochromatic fabric, where it's one color, but multiple shades of that color. And then finally, my block that I have made about color is this. And I thought that a lot of my quilt is going to be made with yellow. And for the color block, it would be nice to acknowledge some of the things that are special about yellow. So I did a green background, and then on it I put some blue shapes, and blue mixed with yellow makes green. So that little bit of color theory I thought was interesting in making this long skinny block about color. That is the end of our segment on the elements of art. I hope that you're not feeling overwhelmed. I hope that as you go through with each of these pages, that you can just hone in, think in a playful way about just that particular prompt. And there's no right or wrong way to interpret it. It can actually be a lot of fun to try to think of the simplest way to show that element. What would be the most straightforward? It's also fun to just cut some of your yardage and say, done, this is my color vignette. Or to find a found object from that appropriation pile that you grabbed and to say, yes, this thing. And I didn't even cut it down yet. I will not be using this whole apron skirt thing. It is much too big. It would overwhelm my quilt. But later I'll cut it down and I'll use a part of it for my shape block or vignette. When you come back for the next segment, hopefully you will have made a majority of your blocks about the elements. If you have one or two that you're stuck on or you want to wait, that's fine. You don't have to rush through them. But when we return, we will be talking about step 3, which is about the postmodern principles of art. Okay, I'll see you then. Welcome back. I hope that you had a lot of fun thinking about the elements of art. A lot of them are familiar words, but it can be a new way of thinking about that word. especially words like value that I'm used to connecting mentally with money, and instead you're thinking about something completely different in that shift from light to dark. We are going to move on now to the next 10 vignettes in our quilt. So you've already made 7 vignettes for the elements. Of course, if you were stuck on some of them, maybe you only have 5 or 4, no big deal. We are going to move on now to these 10. These 10 are slightly more abstract concepts. They can be a little bit more confusing than the elements that probably, if an element is confusing, it's because, can it really be that simple? Can I really just put a line on a piece of fabric? And the answer is yes, you can. These take a little bit more thinking. They're a little bit more complex, but we're going to get into them. I'm going to have some examples of what I've done. I'm going to talk about them more generally as well, and do what you can. Start where it feels easy. You do not have to do them in this order. Do whichever one feels like the most obvious, the most playful, especially if you already have a found object or something at the bottom of your bin of old fabrics. That is a wonderful place to start. Start where it's easy and effortless and move on from there. Our first subject is appropriation. Appropriation is an art world word that people use a lot. We talked about appropriation earlier when we were collecting our fabric. Here you'll see it in more detail, more writing about it. I mentioned both a weaver, some quilters, and some very well-known sculpture and painting people in the art world. As we look at these drawings, we're reminded of our Campbell's tomato soup. And I mentioned to you that there might be a lot of found things that you can just easily grab and say, I'm borrowing that, it's mine now, and you can put it in your quilt. So that is what I did for my appropriation block. I had these 2 quilt blocks that were a gift. I believe they were done by the same person because they're all the same size. There are 4 of them total. I showed you the other log cabin blocks with that matching print previously. And I have chosen these 2 because I like that one is improvisational and one is more traditional. So this is my appropriation vignette, which I have allowed to be 2 of them. I might sew them together to make them one true piece of fabric, but I also feel very comfortable with letting it just be a pair, and they can go anywhere they want on the quilt as I move on. Then we're going to talk about juxtaposition. Juxtaposition is similar to appropriation, but you can't just take one thing and say, here it is. You have to juxtapose it with something. Juxtaposition is about position and contrast, things being next to each other. So it's very important that you take more than one thing and show some contrast. I've written here about many different ways that you can create juxtaposition. I realized that I already had a block that referenced juxtaposition. So I am reusing my texture block as my juxtaposition block. I thought this was pretty clever. It means that if I don't do this again, I will have a total of 7 plus 10 minus 1. So I'll have 16 total vignettes for my quilt rather than 17. This one is contrast, but now it's also juxtaposition because I love the multi-layers of this one. I feel very happy about this block. Recontextualization. That is a big old word. And to me, this one is a little bit more nebulous. It can be a little bit trickier. I've got this example of taking the phrase home sweet home and replacing it with work, sweet work, that replacement is an example of taking a familiar phrase and putting in something else. It is a new context for something. Replacement or subbing something out is a really important aspect in understanding recontextualization. However, this is a vignette that will inherently be part of a larger quilt. Therefore, the item that you take for this step will inherently be recontextualized because it will be part of a quilt. So you don't actually have to have both things side by side. You did for juxtaposition. Juxtaposition, you had to have two things side by side. Here, any item that you take and you put in the new context of being part of the quilt is inherently recontextualized. So you might just choose one thing and put it in there. What I have chosen for this step is two fabrics, and I haven't sewn them to each other yet. This is by far my biggest piece of fabric. So here it's got a lot of white because it was ripped apart a while back. And this is a very pale colored feed sack. It is some kind of egg mash for, I think for helping chickens. I think it's chicken food, but it's very faded. This is kind of a precious fabric that I got a couple years ago, and I've been thinking, oh, when will I use it? It's too special. Well, I'm using it in this quilt. Hopefully that is permission for you to use a special fabric in your quilt also. So just by using this, which was a feed sack, and now it's in a quilt, there's of course a history of that. So I like the historical context of using a feed sack, but also I like the idea of me doing it now when obviously I live in a time of great abundance where I have access to loads of fabrics. I think part of what recontextualizes this is by also incorporating this very charming, also vintage print of chickens. If you look close, you can see that the element of shape has the outline of chickens on here. There's also a lot of the element of line, and certainly there's a very strong sense of color in this being all green. But I like the idea of using two chicken fabrics in the context of my quilt. I think that there's something playful there, and even though it's not hitting you over the head as recontextualization, it counts. So remember when you are doing this, that even if it in a subtle kind of sideways way works, that is good enough for this quilt. Artists in general are great at being sneaky and bending rules. We're moving on to layering. Layering is primarily about abundance. So there's kind of an opposite energy to what I just did with recontextualization. It was fabrics from a time when there wasn't abundance. Here, if you think about the printing press, the affordability of fabric, anything that's about adding and having lots and lots of things, that's what this postmodern principle is about. Layering, if you talk to an artist off the street and you say, juxtaposition, what does that mean? They will know exactly what I previously described juxtaposition to be. Layering is not as obvious. People don't always talk about it in this way. It's part of this really cute list of postmodern principles that I've cited my reference points for that in the notes later on. And layering, there might be a better word for it, but it's about this idea that right now artists have things in abundance. So I thought about, what do I have in abundance, or what could I easily do? Certainly I could just zip something off on the sewing machine and mix it in with all this hand piecing, and that would be interesting. But I have another gift that was mailed to me, all of these little pinwheel squares. And they just go on, and there's different shades of black and white, but usually the same background fabric, except for there's one maverick block that has blue in it, if we can find it in the mix. And I thought, here's my maverick block. So that's the difference. Got my blue right there. So I thought this would be great fun, and I love that they're little, and I'll be able to use them as I'm sewing my vignette together. These can be everywhere. I can mix them all together, and there can be a pinwheel here, a pinwheel there, a little clump of pinwheels. Maybe I'll even chop some of the pinwheels up and redistribute them depending on how things shake out, or certainly, you know, if any of the seams rip or anything, then I'll use little bits of them. I can applique them on top of things, or I can machine piece them together. So this spoke to me really powerfully about abundance. And I think a lot of us have seen supplies like this, where somebody made a bunch of quilt blocks and then they never got around to finishing it. And it can feel really wonderful to give these a life, make them a quilt, instead of just sitting in storage. And it connects to the concept of layering. Text is a really big, important postmodern principle of art. This is a real workhorse in the art world. There are a lot of artists who use text. Within the quilt world, and especially the modern quilt world, there are a lot of quilters who use text. Recently, our charity quilt for QuiltCon was focused on text. So this is trendy right now. It's just part of the creative world. And there are a lot of different ways that you can incorporate text. You can use the same word over and over and over again with that idea of layering, so that the word almost becomes meaningless. You can also have some text on the side where, how could the text not be a focal point? Our eyes long to read things if there's something available to read. But could it be subtler? Could the color be softer so that reading the text isn't the first thing that you do when you see your quilt? You can find text on your fabrics, like I showed you, that great big stack of text fabrics, or you can piece your own text and you can say what you want. You can also embroider text. I do a lot of embroidering text. I would say that's probably the most typical choice that I have made in my work to date. So it felt fun to do something with found text as opposed to embroidering my own text. I already have my chicken mash feed sack, and so I thought I'll use the other one that I own. These are all of my feed sacks. This one especially fit with my yellow color scheme that I was working with. I think I will seam rip this and open it up. You can see it's already starting to split open a little. So again, that will give me some nice negative space, this big yellow area that's the back of the sack. These are seeds instead of for a chicken. And I'm excited to take on the challenge of piecing this text into the quilt. I also, as I'm doing each of these vignettes, I'm starting to get a more cohesive plan in my head, gelling together. And I liked the way I'm creating the principle of rhythm, of repeating things, by having the text show up in more than one block. So I'm already just intuitively, as I look at my blocks laying together as I've been preparing them, I'm starting to use those principles of art intuitively, all on my own naturally. And I thought, let's use 2 feed sacks instead of 1. And let's have an abundance of text. showing up in the quilt. Hybridity is another postmodern principle of art. This one is interesting. A lot of us know the word hybrid, especially when we think of a hybrid car. We're also familiar with fusion cooking, where you've blended cuisines from two different places. That type of thinking is happening in art. It has been happening in art. It's always very interesting to see something from the early 1900s where a Western artist is depicting something from Asia or vice versa, the way that cultures initially represented each other or took on some of their supplies or ways of doing things or ways of making things. So hybridity is about blending a variety of things. Certainly, if you made a video and projected that video on your quilt and that was your finished work of art, that would be hybridity, or you're blending technology and quilting. But we're probably inherently doing a lot of things connected to hybridity anyways. I know that I, for example, get very excited about quilting techniques from a variety of different cultures instead of just sticking to, for example, the Western quilting that my grandmother did. I love being inspired by the thicker threads that I see in quilts in Japan, in India, as well as African American quilts. And I even have an Amish quilt that exists in my bedroom. It's from 1910. It's on the wall, not on the bed. And that has thick thread in it. So fusing the thick thread with other materials. In 2015, I went to South Korea, in Seoul, in a neighborhood called Insadong, and I took a class from Sam Zizarang, and I learned how to do a bojagi, or Korean patchwork jogakbo technique. So it felt intuitive to me for this hybridity prompt to do some Korean patchwork. This is a special whip stitch, and I've used red thread, which stands out beautifully here. And the fabric that I sewed together is a striped curtain. I like that a lot of Korean patchwork is used to make a curtain or to make something that's transparent like a curtain. So it felt like a nice moment of hybridity to use that Korean patchwork whip stitch with fabric from a curtain. Nice little maybe double or triple moment of hybridity there. Gazing is about observation. Sometimes we'll talk in art about the male gaze and why a lot of, especially if there's nudity, usually it's a nude woman more often than a nude man. Although if you go to Italy, you'll see plenty of nude male sculptures. But gazing, that you're looking at something, that the viewer is viewing and looking at the art, and sometimes the art looks back. And there can be a lot of interesting questions around who is the intended viewer and how are they looking at that art. So there's a lot of stuff to consider. You don't necessarily have to just depict eyes, right? It doesn't have to be that in some area of your quilt there is a portrait of someone staring back at you. There are a lot of ways to reference gazing, looking, repeatedly looking, certainly anything that references the quilt police. That's about people anticipating who's going to look at their quilt. So many options as we consider gazing. I realized that I have this portrait that I made of myself probably in 2009. This is the moment where I cut my hair real short, and I was very much a high school art teacher. This was a sample for a class that I was teaching. I printed this photo of my face on cardstock, and then I went along and I drew my face with thread. I'm going to try to carefully remove the staples, remove the paper from the back of this, and then I will incorporate this picture of me looking off to the side. And to me, it also has that nice element of being a throwback of the way I looked at myself then and how am I looking at myself now, and how does my appearance even just look inherently different now. Representation is a really fun, really special aspect of art today. In the past, artists didn't get to express so much about their lives. They were hired to depict religious things or to make a portrait of a particular person who was paying them a commission because photography didn't exist and they wanted a portrait painted. It is a relatively new thing within the art world that the artist can be known and can be the subject of their art. So the mere fact that you are making something that's about you, about the way you interpret things, the way you see these elements and principles of art, that makes a lot of your work inherently connected to representation. There were a lot of fabrics that I chose that connected to my identity simply because they are fabrics gifted to me by my family, or fabrics that when I look at them, I have a visceral memory of having used that fabric frequently. Just a little piece of that fabric would be enough to satisfy making this vignette. You might also think about the way that you quilt. Like, what's your style? Do you have a signature thing that you do where, for example, with me, if someone looks at a quilt, how do they know it's a Heidi Parkes quilt? What am I doing there? And can I do a little swatch of that to show my identity as a quilter? I can also get into any number of personal aspects of my identity. Here I did it's kind of a nice update compared to my old portrait of myself. I did this portrait of myself with the person that I'm dating right now, and that's part of my identity, what I look like. But it's not all. And there are many, many other ways that you can describe your identity and create representation beyond just showing your face. So here I have this piece of fabric that I was sewing on earlier this week. I didn't know where it was going to go or what I was going to do with it. I just was teaching a workshop and demonstrating this technique that I call pleating. And that is such an important part of who I am as well. I am very much a teacher. Here I am teaching right now. So it makes sense to me, both for representation, that I'm representing something that I teach to other people, as well as part of this, I traced my hand and then I sewed around that with something that I like to call a pleat or a pin tuck. So this handprint of mine feels almost like back to the caves of Lascaux. Those cave paintings of hands. Like, this is me, it's mine, it's representing me, as well as representing me as a teacher currently, and also representing my style of liking to do things that are subtle without a lot of color in them, very minimal. So here I am. This is my piece on representation. Obsessive. This one was very tempting to me to spend a whole day making a little 5-inch square with all kinds of crazy detail on it. But the clock is ticking for this workshop and I had to think of something else. So one thing that I noticed as I was sifting through my fabrics, and especially looking for representation-based fabrics, things that had to do with my past and my family, I noticed that I have 10 strawberry fabrics. I didn't spend money on any of these fabrics. These were all given to me not as a present, but just because someone had them and they were done with them. And they're all strawberries. And I think there's an element of obsession. If I have 10 fabrics that are all of the same thing, this 100% counts as an obsession vignette. Especially, I really like this little strawberry shortcake. That is appropriation also. Strawberry shortcake belongs to someone. I certainly remember watching Strawberry Shortcake as a child in the 80s. But obsessive in my drawing here, I have bunnies. The rabbit to me represents me in a way. I feel a kindred spirit with that animal. Like there's a lot that I can learn about myself when I learn about the rabbits. So I drew a bunch of rabbits. I also was thinking about postage stamp quilts and the way that you obsessively collect fabric or go through every single fabric that you have. And I couldn't even do it all. I gave up and only filled in that amount of the squares. It was a lot of coloring in to do. So whatever obsessive thing that you can think of, it doesn't have to take forever. It could just be sewing 10 pieces of fabric together. But which 10? Is there something that's a weird little idiosyncrasy about your fabric stash as well? This is our last postmodern principle of art, and it is called economy. Economy is the idea that less is more. It connects very much to minimalism. And you can work on economy from multiple points of view. It could be, how can you have something that's very simple, like a blank slate? It could also be about effortlessness. Effortlessness in sewing, in moving, in thinking. Effortlessness in spending money. Right? What do you already have? What costs you nothing to do? That is this element of economy. How can you have something that looks cool and not put much work into it? As I was thinking about this for my quilt, I realized that with my 2 feed sacks, having the back of those feed sacks, a big plain yellow area and a big plain white area, I already had a fair amount of economy in terms of negative space. Right? That element, negative space, on my quilt top. So I didn't feel that I needed a plain blank void for my economy block. Instead, I decided to go again for a found object. I'm using quite a lot of found objects in my quilt top, and you'll notice later on that that is one of the principles of art. Rhythm, having something show up repeatedly, multiple times, more than once. So I found this handkerchief. It's lovely. I think I bought it for $1 at the rummage sale at the Wisconsin Museum of Quilts and Fiber Art. I like the texture on it. I like that it has an element of economy to it. It's a relatively minimal scarf. It has a nice finished edge. I'm going to put it on my quilt unaltered exactly as it is. I liked that this pulled some of the red, white, and blue color from my chicken mash feed sack, and that the black and white line was interesting. And so this is my element of economy. I am yet again using a found object to quickly go through this stack of prompts. We will soon be returning to do step 4. Step 4 doesn't require any sewing necessarily. It just requires some thinking. So once we're done with all of these postmodern principle blocks, vignettes, we will be pretty close to done adding and inventing things for our quilt. We're going to move on to how do we join all of these vignettes together. So as you're pacing yourself, as you're thinking, gosh, how many vignettes will be in this quilt? That's it. There will be 17 unless you decide to double up like I did for juxtaposition and texture. Although I did 2 blocks for appropriations, so that does push me back to 17. You might do 2 blocks for more than, well, plus I've got all my layers. My goodness, I've got, what, 25 little tiny blocks for my layers. So as you're pacing yourself, as you're laying this out on your floor or your design wall, as you are doing each of these prompts, think about how much space they're taking up. And when you're done with these postmodern principles, that is about the time that you will want to have about the right amount of space filled in. If you want your quilts to be bigger, there are ways to do that. If you want it to be smaller, there are ways to do that too. We'll get into it later. I'll meet you back when you're ready to talk about the principles of art and design. Oh, the sparkle transition. I hope that got you in the right mood to learn about the principles of art. As I am laying things out on my batting right now, and I've cut my batting to be the size that I want the finished quilt to be as a base, so I know what I'm working with. It's a lot like a blank canvas. So now I'm laying things out and following my intuition, and then you will see how I later make different choices with the principles in mind. We have arrived at step 4 in our pattern, where we identify the principles of art. I made a time-lapse video of myself laying out my fabrics. Certainly I did some initial playing around with how to adjust them. I have previously cut some batting, and that is on my floor, and that's helping to contain the space of the quilt so that I can work with this as a picture plane that I'm adding to rather than a limitless expanse on the floor. I am going to go through each of the principles of art, and I will identify where they are being used in my quilt. So, balance. When we look at the description of balance, it talks about radial, symmetrical, and asymmetrical balance. It clearly looks like my quilt ultimately will be done with asymmetrical balance overall. Are there moments of radial or symmetrical balance within the quilt? Yes, kind of. Certainly this pinwheel, if you just look at the way the fabric is cut, it is both symmetrical and radial. But once you incorporate the color, it becomes just a radial design. It's no longer symmetrical. These squares here are symmetrical. Ultimately not radial once you put more than one block together, but the individual blocks are also radial. Some of the things that I have cut, for example, these 2 gradients, are ultimately symmetrical. You could fold them in half and they would be pretty similar. This rectangle is symmetrical. A majority of the work, though, is asymmetrical. Things may move a lot, but certainly at the center of the quilt, this is symmetrical, as well as this courthouse steps is symmetrical. When we move on to contrast, contrast is about opposites, as well as, do I have a full spectrum of color on the quilt? So certainly I can notice right away I have a fair amount of white. I also have a fair amount of black. That black is achieved especially through my layering vignette, as well as my gazing vignette, and my, what is that one called? Economy, my economy piece. In terms of color, am I using many contrasting colors? The contrasting color of yellow is purple. There's a tiny bit of purple here and here. I also have used a lot of red and green, more than I initially realized. There's red, 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 lots of red, as well as I've got 1, 2, 3, 4 sources of green. So noticing those contrasting or complementary colors are very interesting to pay attention to. So I've got light and dark. I've got a contrast of 2 sets of contrasting colors. I have some blue, no orange. Well, this little bit of orange, so that's contrasting as well. As I continue to look for other moments of contrast in all of these squares, I am aware of the contrast of prints versus solids. I've used both print and solid. A lot more prints than solids, actually. I also noticed the contrast of text with things that don't have text. As I was playing around looking at everything, I initially thought maybe the text would be in the middle or side by side, but now the text is anchored on the left of the quilt and it moves over to no text. I may want to continue to play with my layout so that the text is more evenly dispersed, or perhaps I want the text to be on the right side of the quilt rather than the left side. Another moment of contrast is negative space versus positive space. When I initially laid down both of these feed sacks, I had them split open and there was a lot of negative space next to the text. I played with putting things on top of that I would ultimately applique in place, and it just felt so unbalanced. I wasn't achieving that element of asymmetrical balance. Things seemed overly empty. So contrasting negative space with active space may be a challenge for me within this quilt with these vignettes. Our next principle is emphasis. When I look at this quilt, especially if I squint, where are the moments of emphasis? Certainly upon opening my eyes, I notice this layered block. This really moves around across the surface of the quilt and it's very noticeable. I notice the text. I think I just innately long to read things, have some curiosity about it. That is a moment of emphasis. I think also seeing a human, both because it's a person's face, it's the face of me, the artist, as well as it being the highest accumulation of work. The most labor went into that piece if you look at it as a concentrated area. So that is a real focal point within the quilt. I think it's something that people will notice. It was a struggle for me to place. I'm going to talk later about why I probably ultimately will not leave it there. But in terms of emphasis, those are some of the top places that draw my eye. I think also the green color is remarkably noticeable because there's perhaps even more of it than I initially realized that I was incorporating. Pattern. The principle of pattern. There's a lot of pattern in this quilt. More pattern than I am probably used to working with. There's the pattern in this layered block that has an inherent pattern to it. There are a lot of patterned fabrics, lots of prints. There also is the pattern in this piecing, the pattern of vignettes that are about the same size as each other. So that maybe is moving more towards rhythm than pattern, but certainly pattern, 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 pattern. Lots of patterns to be paying attention to noticing the blocks that they're in. Movement. Movement is a very important principle, and movement is perhaps one of the things that I right now, just initially looking at this quilt top, am struggling with. Number one, having my face over here, I'm looking away, and will that cause the viewer to just mosey on by? A lot of times when you enter a work of art, you start on the top, especially with the text here, as though I'm reading a book. I'm gonna come in here and read this, and then I'm gonna get registered on that left to right, reading a book page. When I get over here and my portrait is looking to the side, I might think, oh, what's the next work of art to look to? And I might not be redirected back into the quilt. So either my quilting would have to redirect me, or I'm gonna have to move that because the direction that I'm gazing, that I'm looking, is directing the view of the viewer. It's altering the way that the viewer's eye moves around the quilt. All of the things that I identified as focal points, those are like stars in a constellation that you move from boop, 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 boop. And you want the viewer's eye to keep circling around, to keep lingering on your quilt, to give them a satisfying experience of viewing a work of art for an extended period of time, rather than just see it and walk on past. So movement in that sense, I think, still needs some work on this particular layout that I have. I think some things that I can work with to create powerful movement are these layering blocks. These are going to keep my eye moving around. They create a lot of activity, almost a spinning in my eye. I can use to my advantage the direction that my eyes are looking. This line, the way that this plant is growing, that has some very strong directionality to it. That can point my eye somewhere. These greens are all such skinny lines. I can create a border, a line, lots of interesting shapes with this green line that's in the quilt, which makes me realize, where is my line fabric? I'm gonna have to find my element of line. That is missing, obviously needs to be reincorporated. Don't lose anything as you're laying things out. That line is going to help me a lot with the element of movement. It's going to be able to point and direct people's gaze as they look at this quilt top. So important that I find that I get it in here and that I use it as a tool to guide my viewer's eye. Rhythm. Rhythm is the element that I talk about the most frequently when I teach quilting classes. I will repeatedly have a rhythm in my voice with students as I bring up the subject of rhythm. How do you create rhythm? Especially a quilt top like this with all these disparate things. We didn't have a cohesive plan when we started. We just thought, let's start making these vignettes, and now we'll have to deal with them. So it's wonderful that we've created some problems to solve. That pushes us, that makes us do more interesting, innovative things. Certainly this layout isn't done yet. As I think about the rhythm in my work of art, what do I repeatedly see? The focal points are a clue at rhythm. Also cutting things up, creating stripes, creating layers. There are lots of different ways that I can organize this that can accentuate the element of rhythm where things repeat, where you see something over again. I could even go so far as to cut up some of these feed sacks so that they are creating rhythm rather than just creating one static frozen moment in the quilt. And our last principle of art is unity. Unity is, how do we get this quilt to sing together as one cohesive, thoughtful work of art? One option is that we may need to add more fabric to our quilt top. If I were to use more of this green, more of that green, if I were to use a larger expanse of this fabric, that can show up again and again and create some rhythm, create a consistency in the quilt. Lots of these fabrics, I have more of them. I have more of this curtain, I have more of these yellows, I have so much more strawberry fabric. So how would I potentially use more of that to create a more cohesive look in the quilt? I also need to remember, and I'm a big believer in this, not everybody is, I am. I think that covering a quilt with quilting, with thick thread, with a contrasting color, it creates an overall look to the quilt that gives it unity that it doesn't have when it's just a patchwork. So something can look sort of homely even when you're done piecing it, that can ultimately be resolved by the unity that's created by having stitches everywhere in that quilting phase. So there are things I can do now to create unity, but as we move on to quilting the quilt, we're going to create a whole lot more unity. We will meet back with the composition phase. So right now, you do not need to decide the ultimate layout of your quilt. What I suggest is that you read through the principles, you identify the moments where you see that principle. Definitely lay out all your fabrics so you can look at them all at once. Don't leave them in a little pile. And meet back when you're ready for step 5, composition. We will figure out together how to piece all of these little vignettes together to make a quilt. Having just identified your principles of art, we are ready to move on to step 5, composition. Here, we need to think about 3 to 5 things that we're going to have in mind as we do our layout. When I talked to you before, I was saying that the visual movement in my quilt top was not looking right. There were some things that were odd about it. And so that would definitely be one of the principles that I needed to focus on as I move forward. We're going to talk about what other principles, elements, postmodern principles I would want to focus on as I move forward in my quilt top. And to do that, I'm going to share a PowerPoint with you where we can look at the video of me rearranging my quilt top with some of these things in mind. So we're going to just share my screen, take a look at a PowerPoint. Okay, you guys have already seen this, but I'm going to talk you through it. This is me initially laying out my fabrics for the very first time, splitting some of them open. I didn't know what they would be like. We're getting a sense of the expansiveness of that skirt, how much space is taken up by the feed sacks, and how those other vignettes are interacting with each other. So here, as you know, we discussed the way that my movement was not optimized because my face is looking out to the right. It's encouraging someone to leave the picture plane rather than to enter it. This chicken also, he is looking away as well. These are two things that could be looking at each other rather than looking away from one another. And that is going to do a lot to improve the visual movement in my piece. Now I have done the work to identify my principles in the quilt top. I have also located my line vignette. And I'm going to start rearranging things based on the observations that I made when I looked at the principles of art. So I'm immediately moving the text over to the right side of the page that gets the viewer's mind out of that mindset of reading and moving left to right. I also move my face to the left side so that I'm looking at myself. I've extended the yellow so that here now I'm getting a really long strip because I'm matching my value vignette with my line vignette, as well as connecting it to my texture vignette. So I've clumped this yellow together. The handkerchief from my economy vignette, that is inviting the viewer in. It's like an arrow pointing to this other red, white, and blue image, which then points directly in a line across and leads the viewer's eye in this circular triangle to invite it back in to keep looking at the quilt top. As I continue here, I start to lay out my layering vignettes. I've got a lot of them. I'm seeing how I can use them as a frame rather than as these disparate clumps that were moving about within my picture plane. I also notice here that when before it seemed like, oh, I didn't have enough space to fit everything. Now there's plenty of space. And so I was able to go back in, and that same pile that I got these initial 2 appropriation vignettes from, I had 2 more of them. So if I put all 4 in this vertical line together, maybe that's an interesting way forward. As we look here now, this is where my quilt top is at currently, and I feel so much better about it. I had a moment looking at it previously, going through and identifying the principles, thinking maybe this is a terrible quilt pattern, and that is not the case. Things are starting to look great now, and I want you to really be able to pay attention to how many times I arranged and rearranged my vignettes. I am sure that I will continue to adjust them, but this is a great moment of seeing the dramatic change that can happen when you start to apply the elements and principles in contrast to just haphazardly laying things out on the picture plane. So again, when I look at the visual movement in my piece, if I start up top with this great big red square, which is very attention grabbing, it has this wonderful diagonal that cuts across these red squares. Maybe even if I moved that red square over, it would, or is that too on the nose? I'm not sure. There's this other red bit. I'm traveling through this blue circle, and I'm making my way to the chicken and the egg mash. That text is really drawing me in, making me curious. But I follow the gaze of the chicken, following this line back over here. I look up at all these pinwheels and I start to see my eyes. And again, I go on this little trip around the quilt. So both of these items are bringing me in, and this chicken is bouncing me back into the work. This lone pinwheel I think is pretty interesting. This is my Maverick pinwheel. You can see it's got blue instead of the same color that all the other ones are made of. That's interesting to have it next to my personality, next to my gaze. One part of the quilt that I don't feel fully settled on yet is my representation block. I may want to revisit that. I might want to make something different. It just seems so plain and quiet compared to the rest of the quilt. So maybe I want to delete it entirely, or maybe I want to swap something out for it, find something else to represent me. As I look at my step 5 composition worksheet, I can start to think now, if movement is really important for me, which other element, principle, postmodern principle do I want to bring in and be thoughtful about? Because all this rearranging that I did was really just thinking about the principle of movement. So if I want to focus more on color, the way that the yellow is really working powerfully with my feed sack bouncing over to these other bits of yellow, maybe I want to add more green. As I piece them, is there a type of thoughtfulness that I want to bring to piecing them? Speaking of piecing, you'll notice our first bullet point here is asking about how you're going to sew them together. Do you want to add extra fabric? Certainly, I have more of a lot of the fabrics that I used in the quilt top, as well as the backs of the feed sacks. And when I start to assemble the quilt top, how will I assemble it? Am I hand piecing or machine piecing? What is going to be a convenient way for me to assemble this quilt top? When I look at this one and I dissect it as it is, I start to see the makings of some strips. Certainly, I can see sewing the two feed sacks together. That's a vertical strip. Then it starts to break down to horizontal strips. If I sew this bottom section together, this is pretty straightforward. Here's a strip at the bottom, and then here's this clump, this strip. Then I'm going to go in and do this next section here. This is going to come together pretty simply, sewing it together. Then up here, I've got this, oh, but it's bumping in. So maybe this whole area, I'm going to sew that together. But that's broken it down from being just one big quilt. How do I figure that out? To being one shape, two shapes, three shapes, four shapes, five shapes, six shapes. So it's 6 smaller parts that I need to sew to each other instead of being all of these blocks, which is a lot of blocks and could be intimidating. So consider if you want to machine piece, how do you do that? Also, things like my handkerchief, things like these feed sacks, they have finished edges or very interesting raw edges. And I can do something called safety pin applique, where I just safety pin them together and then the quilting holds them ultimately in place. That way, I don't have to lose that beautiful finished edge on the handkerchief. I can just safety pin it to the other areas of the quilt, and then my quilting will hold it down. So I've got a little more work to do. And especially, I need to think about my other elements of composition. As I go through here, line, shape, form, value, space, texture, color. I think for me, of those elements, color is proving to be the most important. So I might say that movement is important for me and color is important for me. As I look through the next ones, appropriation, juxtaposition, recontextualization, layering, text, hybridity, gazing, representation, obsessive, and economy. Well, this isn't a minimal quilt. I think there is an element with those pinwheels that does start to seem a little bit obsessive. Is that something that I could accentuate? Or gazing, so much of the principle of movement that is incorporated here is in gazes, is me looking back and forth and reading and anticipating the viewer reading. So perhaps gazing is another important thing for me to keep track of. As we continue, balance, contrast, emphasis, pattern, movement, rhythm, and unity. I think I might add unity because that These are very disparate, strange things, and I don't always use appropriated bits of piecing. I've been collecting them. I think they're cool, but I haven't used them much before. So ultimately, I would say that my top 5 are color, movement, unity, gazing, and appropriation, because I've got to deal with all of this stuff that I've appropriated and how to make it make sense visually. I'm going to keep those 5 in mind, and I'm going to both hand and machine piece these together, doing what feels most time effective as well as most enjoyable for me. I hope that you have fun going through this worksheet, and that then you will be able to make some of these kinds of really savvy decisions around the structure of your quilt. We will meet back and see a little bit more of my work in this composition phase. I'm going to sew it together, and I'm going to talk to you about that process. It's a new day. I'm in a new outfit, and you can see that I moved that representation block, and I am using that vignettes approach of segmenting things as I sew them to each other. Here you can see that I have just finished the sewing machine aspect of this quilt top, and I'd like to explain what you just saw in the time lapse. I began in the top corner of the quilt, and I was thinking about those sections that I described previously. So even though it was tempting to sew this strip of patchwork together, I didn't do it that way because it didn't make sense for how I would be able to ultimately sew things together in more of a strip quality. So to begin, I sewed these pieces together, and then I did my safety pin applique. I safety pinned this handkerchief that has a beautiful raw edge. The raw edge will be visible now on the finished quilt. You can see about here, it stops having that double layer, and then there's nothing underneath the handkerchief. And when I got to this edge, and I eventually cut the piece from my space vignette, I simply ironed under the edges. I made sure that I didn't sew this all the way over, so that way it is possible to fold it under. Here you can see it's just a corner folded under right there, and I'll make sure I tuck that raw edge under as I hand sew that in place. So all of this is folded and safety pinned. Here, this is also a folded edge because I had this beautiful raw edge right here with this lace that was on this found block. I did sew the block to these additional pinwheels though. When I got to my embroidery of my face, I also used this beautiful vintage lace edge. So that's a raw edge, but it's finished edge. This also, I could have sewn that with a machine, but it just seemed like it would be pretty to do it with the handwork, to have a little more of my identity that way, even on this side of the quilt. As you continue this way, you can see that I've folded this edge, and then I've safety pinned it. So there's a fair amount of work that still needs to happen with hand sewing where I have these safety pins. But a majority of the quilt has been sewn together with my sewing machine. And that's very exciting because the quilt top, I can pick it up. I could flap it in the breeze. If I wanted to just do the safety pin applique everywhere, I certainly could start quilting this now and just do a lot of quilting where the raw edges are. But it's going to be more fun for me to go in and hand stitch the places that aren't a raw edge, like the handkerchief that I want to leave with the safety pins. But a lot of areas I can go in now, I can sew them by hand. I kept my batting as a framework, and I was really surprised as all those seam allowances crept up, I had some extra space at the bottom of my quilt. I thought that I might not have room visually, spatially, for this block that was about representation. And yet I was able to squeeze it in. So I deleted it from the quilt and then I added it back in as there was space. So that is really exciting to me that it is sewn in. There is a little bit of a diagonal happening here, and I'll just need to cut to get out my ruler and check, is it that the batting was a different shape? Is it this? How do I feel about it? I may ultimately add another little strip of something to the bottom if it isn't super square. I might also decide that the amount of squareness that I have there is just fine. And also maybe I'll be fine with starting right here, just trimming that and then having this come up a little bit. I want to make sure this is part of my quilt, which is a big part of why I didn't just have the quilt end right there. But this part is all negotiable as far as I'm feeling about it. So it could kind of dip up and be just a nice little rounded shape at the bottom. This shape piece ended up being smaller. I certainly could have jogged that over, but I thought it might be actually really pretty to have this overlapping it a bit. So, and of course I went through and looked, and I know that orange is not a very popular color on my quilt top. I did also cut this block down. That's my color block, and I used part of it all the way over here. So it found a new home, as well as this vintage block. I cut it in half to fill in some of that extra space. And you can see right here, my texture vignette that I folded under at an angle. It gave me a nice curve because all I had to do was iron that edge under. And then it accommodated fitting this block while also showing all of the trapunto that I added. And then for my recontextualization, I was very happy that I was able to have this chicken silhouette fabric right next to my chicken. So the composition aspect is complete, and I have just a little bit of hand sewing to do to merge everything together. I hope that the concepts behind sewing them together are helpful. There are lots of ways that you can do this. You can use the same way right here where I added some of this extra fabric. If you're finding things aren't fitting, maybe you just do this a whole bunch. You just build everything up to be an easier, more convenient size to sew together. You end up with lots of blocks of a particular fabric. Creates more rhythm within your work because you see that one fabric repeat a whole bunch. And then you don't have to do that hand piecing that I did, or things that are kind of complicated and heady. You're able to just add a little extra fabric everywhere. Creates a wonderful sense then of unity and rhythm within your quilt top. So this is one way to sew them together. There's so many solutions, and I look forward to being able to talk about some of that together online with the Vignettes Quilt hashtag on Instagram, and certainly in other spaces as well. That's where I'm at. This is one of my favorite parts in the process of making a quilt. I'm doing some visible hand piecing. In with the pattern, you received a zine on visible hand piecing. I was talking about the safety pin applique, where things are safety pinned, and that's all I'm going to do. Later I'll just quilt right on over it, especially with that handkerchief that you can see in the top left corner of the screen right now. What I'm doing here is at the beginning of that zine, a running stitch applique. Now,
Obviously it's not applicated, I'm using it to piece, but it's the same ironed under edge. I'm sewing it exactly as though it were applique, and I'm using a running stitch on the top. I like to use a quilter's knot to start my thread. I like to use a tailor's knot to end my thread. A lot of my short little tutorials on YouTube and Instagram show those knots in detail. And here I am about to go into the whip stitch. So that's one of the other stitches on the visible hand piecing zine. Here you can see those beautiful little stitches that are perpendicular to the seam itself. It's slower. Probably in this moment I was watching a TV show and I needed to toggle over to the next episode, so I was still for a moment. But the whip stitch is something that I like to do all over, as you can see here, but I also like to do the whip stitch when I reach a corner. So especially by this orange peel fabric, there are a lot of corners for those pinwheels. I'm going to do a running stitch for most of it to be fast, but at the corner I did 3 little whip stitches, both the innie corner and the outie corner. This is such a complex shape. You've got to look at the still image, the silhouette of that orange peel vignette. I love how complicated it is. I think it makes the quilt look super beautiful. And you can see in this video here, it was very easy to do that piecing. I safety pinned it where it was laying flat, and then watched a movie or two, or an episode or two, and was able to just really simply in one sit down go through and sew all of it. You can see that I remove the safety pins as I am sewing, and it's a great technique. I hope you'll try it as you piece this.
Here we are ready for the very last step. We're looking at quilting and also at variations. So here, this quilt has been basted. You can see the safety pins in it. And I really get to enjoy and appreciate the way that I can see each of the elements and principles showing up in the quilt. I can notice especially the moments of appropriation. I think that that is a really big element in this particular outcome of the quilt. For you, you might have a different element that is really noticeable in your quilt. As we move on to quilting, we start to have the opportunity to choose an element, a principle, or a postmodern principle to emphasize as we continue with quilting. So for example, if I were to emphasize unity, I might start with this block that I did about contrast, and I could quilt it courthouse step style across the whole surface of the quilt. I might use gold thread to quilt my way along the bottom and along the top, and perhaps white thread at the sides. That unity of covering everything with one approach could be interesting. I might also focus on color. Yellow has been an important color for me in this process, and I might choose to use a big variety of shades of yellow thread to quilt it. As I look through this list of all of my different options, things that I could focus on, maybe I just want to be done. I focus on economy. I go with economy of movement, and I quilt straight rows that go across with just 2-inch gap between each row. And that would be a way of focusing and choosing. So take your time looking through here, perhaps vividly picture what would my quilt look like depending on which of these I focus on. And once you get a picture in your mind's eye that you really enjoy and appreciate, you can quilt it. You might choose to quilt with a sewing machine, or quilt by hand, or perhaps even a combination of the two. You might quilt from one fixed starting point and work out from there, or you might quilt from a variety of angles. As you get to your areas of safety pin applique, you can see that this is still held only in place with safety pins. And I just want to be mindful as I quilt it that my quilting is dense enough that it holds all of those layers in place, which is pretty easy to make happen. If you're quilting over an embroidery, each quilting stitch has an over and an under, and you might try to be strategic about doing an under stitch so that you don't break some of those lines at moments that are really important in your embroidery. I also know that from some of my appropriated items, I have little spots that need some mending. So here there's a hole in this feed sack, and I might want to quilt extra there to resolve it. So whether you are focused on an element or a principle or a postmodern principle, there's a way to bring that energetically into your quilt as you decide how to quilt it. What does obsessive quilting look like? I think that that could be a really exciting option to consider. So see what feels right for you, and I look forward to seeing your results. Remember that we are using the Vignettes Quilt hashtag, so I look forward to seeing everybody sharing their work. Thank you, and bye-bye. Like a portal into the future, this quilt is now quilted. I've taught this workshop as a virtual class and an in-person class. And I'm excited to share with you some details about the quilting. When we get up close, you can start to see the way that I was careful about my over and under stitches. So here in my face, I didn't cut through my eyes. I was sort of clever about the direction of things there. I also did this safety pin applique. My handkerchief is not attached with glue or piecing stitches. It is only quilted in place. And you can see that most of the time I used an overstitch rather than an understitch to tack that down. Right here is an exception. You can see that I went under right on the edge of the handkerchief. I also used the quilting to break up the handkerchief so it didn't feel too much like one big complete piece sitting on the top of things. There's this lovely row of knots where the direction of my quilting has changed. I went for all black quilting to create a sense of unity. Unity ended up being the most important principle in my mind when I was making decisions around quilting. I thought that there was a lot of black already in the quilt, especially from the pinwheel, from my layering block. And I wanted to create some balance with that, to unify things. I began quilting with a curved line that arcs across this way. I laid out a piece of thread on the floor, put a series of straight pins in, and then just like I was playing dot to dot, went from pin to pin to pin, and then every inch or so arced my way downward as I quilted that shape. Then I made this vertical line of quilting, and I chose that probably most thoughtfully out of anything in the quilt because of how I wanted it to interact with my face. So again, I laid thread across my face, horizontally, vertically, curved, diagonally, and this slightly arced vertical line is what looked most pleasing. And I liked the connection that it made again between my gaze and the gaze of the chicken. From there, I got a little bit sneaky. So as we get a little closer, you can see that these vertical lines extend up to here. They meet with a horizontal line that goes across and then blends with the horizontal lines of that arc above the chicken. To make that work, my straight line stopped here. I continued the arc that circles around the chicken here, and then I have these horizontal lines that go across. That is what creates that beautiful separation that happens on the handkerchief. And then again, just to create some more visual interest, to keep things unified and with a sense of balance, I created this vertical bit across the top. Could have easily kept going horizontally there, but I liked the punctuation, the level of detail that happened with those knots, because my Hardy Champion seeds get a little plain up there at the tippy top. So that is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 sections of quilting that I thought about. The knots in the bottom white area across the whole surface of the quilt, I made those with a slip knot to join my old thread and my new thread, as well as a quilter's knot or a tailor's knot when I was starting a new row, for example, here or at the top. And I like how that brings that black color around in the quilt a bit more. Let's take a look at probably the most tricky part of the vignettes piecing, which is this orange peel fabric. So here, one more time, let's look at how I pieced this. I've ironed under the edge of the yellow and then slid the orange peel underneath it, just like if it was applique, but it's not applique. So that visible running stitch runs all the way down. Here you can see how I just paused my quilting, used the same black thread to mend that. I used another scrap of the yellow under there so that you don't see the batting under there. And this running stitch carries all the way down. Look how skinny this little tiny bit of orange peel is. So I've running stitched down, then across, in a different effort, kept stitching here. You can even see the way that my color changes, the way the gold continues around to attach the orange peel, and this green is attaching the other fabric to the chicken. So up we go. I shift to a whip stitch. Maybe that creates a little deception that it's not all just one bit of piecing, but it was. This, you remember, was a curtain, so it had that nice already healed edge, the selvage there. So I whip stitch across and then down. Oh, keep going down. Across with this silk and then up here where my pinwheels are. This section, I just made sure that I was able to fold under on this side and also fold under here. And I kept piecing, another little extra bit of whip stitch all the way up, another angle, and to the top. I quilted with my backing as this yellow and white gingham fabric because I pulled this yellow fabric as a yellow that made sense with my color palette. And then I was able to do my favorite binding technique where I wrap the back around to the front to bind. And I think that that yellow and white color and having the same binding fabric across the whole quilt, again, helped to create some unity. in the quilt. Here at the bottom, I always sign my name on my work. I recommend that you also sign your name. You could do a more complex label as well. So that is embroidered with the back stitch, and I usually do it after I finish quilting. You can see the knot because I like to balance the language on the front of the quilt, on the back of the quilt with the signature as well. It's very easy to hide those knots if I want to, but because there are so many loose knots on the front of the quilt, it made sense to me to leave those loose knots in my signature as well. Here you can see the way that this pleating technique quilted. A lot of extra fabric in pleating, and I love teaching classes on that pleating technique in itself. It's a little bit too detailed to get into in the scope of this particular class. But here you can see how it lays flat. There's a little wrinkle there, but it's no big deal. You can really see my hand here in this representation block, as well as this skinny strip that I added at the bottom to level out the bottom edge of the quilt. Here with my form block, this trapunto. It's nice and three-dimensional. I tried quilting through it and didn't love that, so then I continued to quilt around it. So this just picks up and stops on either side of it. Fun little problem to solve. Here with my tablecloth, where you can see through that lacework in the tablecloth, I put some of that yellow and white gingham fabric, and that's what shines through there. So again, that you don't see the batting in the quilt. And I'm going to shift to a different view for everyone. I recently sewed this shirt for myself with fabric from the same rummage sale at the Wisconsin Museum of Quilts and Fiber Art, so it felt like the appropriate fancy outfit to talk quilts. I love this quilt all around. I love it at a distance. I love it up close. I think that there are a lot of moments to discover something, to be surprised that it actually works together as one whole, and then to get up close and notice some of the detail and the nuance that makes each block unique and special. It is very much a quilt that I feel I would never have thought to make on my own if I hadn't had the pattern. It's kind of a funny sensation for me to be writing patterns because that's not how I typically make quilts. I usually just make them and I don't have a pattern. And so following along, making this quilt with a pattern had a lot of interesting ups and downs. That moment where I was deciding that the chicken and the face needed to look at each other, I sort of panicked inside a little bit because I didn't know if the pattern was going to be a complete flop and turn out terribly, or if it was going to work. And especially now that I have taught the pattern to other people, both in person and virtually, I think a lot of us experience a moment of panic like that when working on this quilt pattern. So don't give up, don't get too afraid. I find for myself that when I have that feeling of panic or fear or wondering, have I just gone down this path that's only leading to trouble, that it often means I'm growing as a maker and as an artist. It means that I am doing something I haven't done before, that I'm in a really interesting, exciting place of creative growth and stretch. So I persevered, I kept piecing it. By the time I was done piecing it, I felt really good about it. And then once I quilted it, I kind of took my breath away. I felt like, did I make that? Because that's not what I would normally be able to do. So I hope for you that you will be feeling persistent enough and open enough to some of those feelings of discomfort that it will work out really beautifully for you to be making this pattern. Remember as well that you have some options, just like in a critique in an art school, just like when I remember being a student and I'd be working away at something, whether it was painting or ceramics or metalworking, and then the teacher would come over and say, like, "Hey Heidi, what's happening over here? What's going on over there?" They'd kind of stir things up. I find my role as a quilting teacher is similar to that I need to sometimes just stir the pot, give you some ideas, some questions, make you wonder about a few things, and it's a little bit what the pattern is doing. And when you get to those end steps, when we start to sew everything together, there are opportunities to delete a block. Just like what I did with this color block, my blue and my green, these circles were my color block. I decided I'm going to cut that block in half. And the other half now lives down here in the bottom part of the quilt. I also decided that this block down here is going to cut it in half. So you don't have to stay married to things being exactly as they are. When you're in that composition phase where you're assembling things, you can make changes. You can delete a block entirely. I remember I thought I might lose my pleating block altogether, that it was out of the quilt. I also rearranged things a lot. Even the way I used these layered blocks, it changed a lot from layout to layout to layout. And I encourage you to push and pull and tug at the vignettes and at the pattern itself. Had I wanted to take this orange peel fabric from my space element and cut it into little strips, like maybe 2-inch strips, and then sew them in between everything, that was open to me as a possibility. You're not stuck with just like a puzzle trying to figure out what is the right shape and size to go in which place. It is up to you to play and invent and change things. So work with some of those feelings of discomfort and allow yourself to find a true solution that actually feels good, that is truly resonating with you as you are making choices when you're quilting. Another thing that I find important is the way that I had Post-it notes with each block, each vignette name written on the Post-it note. That helped me to keep track of things. I found, especially when I was teaching the class in person in June of 2021, that my students at the Wisconsin Museum of Quilts and Fiber Art, they came and they had so many beautiful vintage things, and I had to, if I had maybe one regret in the pattern, I might have made an extra sheet that had each name of the block written out, and then you're able to go through and just cut all of them and pin them to each piece of fabric to just force you a little bit more to actually do that step. Because having a Post-it or a piece of paper reminding you which block is which when you're laying things out, and maybe you didn't do 2 of the elements because you couldn't think of them, and so then later you want to go back and maybe add them, it helps keep you, as we like to say in Wisconsin, you can get recombobulated. So if you're feeling discombobulated about things, that Post-it technique is helpful. Also, when I share this quilt with people who didn't watch this video, who don't know the whole process, and I say, for example, can you guess which of these blocks is my line vignette? There are lots of possible answers, right? Maybe the first option is this portrait of me because it's a line drawing. You might not notice the subtlety of my actual line block. When I say which block is for color, Well, you might think the orange peel because it is the most colorful of all of the blocks. You might not think. You might see this and you think, obviously, that's shape. There are circles there. So to the outside viewer, the viewer does not have to be able to identify these blocks as each vignette. That's part of what's really exciting, that you get to learn about the elements and the principles and the postmodern principles, is that they work together so beautifully. You're always using most of them at any given time. Certainly the elements, you're using them so constantly and fluidly that they are just the building blocks of what art is made of. It's the same as, what is a house made of? Well, most houses are made of very similar materials. Most bodies, most people are made of similar materials. Even what do you want in life? Most people want pretty similar things. That's why they're so elemental. They're everywhere. You can't tell necessarily from one block to the next. The point is that prompt sparked you to do something interesting that you might not have done otherwise. So it's merely the spark from each prompt that's important. It is not essential that it be easily identifiable to the viewer when they look at your quilt. That is a huge difference from my other two patterns. When you think about the Moon Improv quilt and about the Scavenger Hunt quilt, when you look at that quilt, most of us who are familiar with the pattern can be detectives and can figure out which one is which. Oh, I know where their chronological blocks are. I know where the 5 things they touch every day are. I know where they traced one side of their body and used that silhouette. This quilt, not as obvious, right? Even the postmodern principles, there's text on a lot of these. Either of these could very easily be my text block, but only one of them is. The other one snuggled into something else. This one would be so great for the primary colors because it's blue, red, and yellow. So that could very easily be my color block and represent that building block of color theory. Trying to think if there are any other things that you guys might need or want to know. It's definitely been a thrill to see the quilts finished. I love looking at them in the hashtag on Instagram. I really hope that you will post in a public account. Even if you already have a private account, you can have 2 accounts, one private, one public, and you can just share your quilt and other creative endeavors, even if you're anonymous on there. It is beautiful to get to see the different variations of the quilt that are being made. And I'm so appreciative of the people who are really generously sharing their work online with that hashtag. So I hope you'll be inspired to do that as well. I'm a pretty available person. If you send me a DM, I will reply to that on Instagram. I also do one-on-one consultations. There's a tab for that if you go to my website, HeidiParkes.com, there is a purchase tab, and on there is the opportunity to buy a consultation with me. And right now, at least, there's a sliding scale. So depending on your financial situation, you can choose which price point is appropriate for you, and you can reserve an hour with me to talk one-on-one. And especially maybe when you're at that point where you've made all of your blocks and you don't know how to put them together, that could be a great opportunity for the 2 of us to work together and talk about the composition of your quilt as you're piecing it. I think that's it. I'm so grateful to you guys. I love getting to be a quilter. I love getting to write patterns. It just is humbling and amazing to see the moments when people entrust their time and their talent to working with something that I've put out there, whether it's a pattern, an idea like visible hand piecing, whether it's a workshop that you're taking. have this one life to live. Our time is so precious, and I am really grateful that you decided to share some of that time with me. So thank you from the bottom of my heart. I appreciate your support, and I appreciate your trust in me. Look forward to seeing you guys on Instagram. Bye-bye.